There is someone in your life right now that you have decided is against you. Maybe it's a coworker who never acknowledges your ideas, a friend who always seems to say the wrong thing, someone who looked at you a certain way once and never apologized for it. You've built a case against them. You've replayed the evidence. You know what they are, except your brain made them up, not the person, the villain. And the mechanism that built them is one of the oldest, most deeply wired systems in the human brain. It doesn't care whether the villain is real. It only cares that you have one. Most people assume that enemies are made through conflict, through betrayal, through something that was done. And sometimes that's true, but the research tells a different story, a stranger one, because in most cases the enemy isn't built from what someone did. It's built from what your brain needed to explain. In 1947, a psychologist named Fritz Heider ran one of the simplest experiments in the history of social science. He showed people a short film, 35 seconds long. No characters, no dialogue, no story, just two triangles and a circle moving around a screen. When he asked people what they saw, almost nobody described shapes moving. They described a bully. They described a victim trying to escape. They described fear and aggression and intention and cruelty. Two triangles and a circle. And within 35 seconds, every single person watching had invented a social world complete with a villain. Heider called this tendency social attribution, the automatic, involuntary act of assigning motive, personality, and intent to things that have none. Your brain is so powerfully wired to read social meaning into the world that it will find it even where it absolutely cannot exist. But here's what's strange. Heider's experiment wasn't just showing us that humans are creative storytellers, it was revealing something much darker, something about what the brain actually needs in order to feel safe. Because the villain in Heider's film wasn't invented randomly. Almost every person who watched it assigned the same role to the same triangle, the big one, the one with the most presence, the one that took up the most space. Size became threat, presence became malice, and none of it required a single hostile act. Your brain doesn't wait for evidence. It builds the case first, then looks for evidence to support it. Psychologists call this process splitting. It was first described clinically by Melanie Klein in the 1940s, but the mechanism runs in every human brain regardless of psychology or background. Splitting is the mental act of dividing the social world into two categories: safe or unsafe, good or bad. There is no middle category. In infancy, this is essential. A baby cannot hold complexity. It cannot understand that the same parent who is warm and present most of the time might occasionally be unavailable or frustrating, so the brain splits them. The good mother and the bad mother are experienced as two entirely different people. That split is what keeps an infant emotionally stable in a world it can't yet understand. But here's what they don't tell you. Most people never fully outgrow it. The same splitting mechanism that protected you as an infant keeps running quietly in the background of your adult mind. And when stress levels rise, when uncertainty increases, when something in your life feels out of control, it activates. And it goes looking for a villain. In 2003, psychologists Roy Baumeister and Brad Bushman conducted a series of studies examining how people construct what they called enemy narratives. Accounts of conflict in which one party is clearly the aggressor and the other is clearly the victim. What they found dismantled something most people believe about themselves. When people described conflicts from their own lives, they consistently framed themselves as reasonable, restrained, and provoked. The other person was described as unpredictable, malicious, or fundamentally different in character. Not just wrong in this situation, wrong as a person. But when Baumeister and Bushman collected both sides of the same conflict, the accounts were almost unrecognizable as descriptions of the same event. Each person had edited the story, not deliberately, not consciously. Their brains had quietly restructured the memory to protect their self-image and confirm the social role they had already assigned. The villain had been constructed, and the construction was invisible to the person doing it. Think about what that actually means. The story you carry about the person who wronged you, the one you've refined over months or years, the one that feels so solid and so obviously true, was assembled by a brain that had already decided the ending before it started collecting evidence. And it gets stranger. Because the brain doesn't just construct enemies from people who have harmed you, it constructs them from people who simply represent something threatening, something you haven't resolved inside yourself. Carl Jung called this projection the unconscious act of taking a quality you find unacceptable in yourself, fear, ambition, dishonesty, neediness, and placing it outside yourself, locating it in another person, making them the carrier of the thing you won't look at directly, the colleague who irritates you with their relentless self-promotion, the friend whose neediness exhausts you, the stranger online whose certainty makes you furious. Sometimes those feelings are straightforward responses to genuinely difficult behavior, but sometimes the intensity of the reaction is the signal, because a mild annoyance doesn't need a villain. Only a deep, unresolved discomfort does. The psychologist James Hollis spent decades studying why certain people trigger disproportionate responses in us. His conclusion was uncomfortable. The people who provoke the strongest reactions in us are almost always holding up a mirror. The fury isn't really about them, it's about what seeing them makes you feel about yourself. The enemy your brain invented isn't a fiction exactly. They exist. They have flaws. They may have genuinely done something hurtful, but the villain, the role you've cast them in, the story you've built around them, the meaning you've made of every interaction since, that part is yours. Your brain built it to protect you, to give shape to something that felt threatening, to restore the feeling of understanding in a situation that felt confusing or out of control. And here is the part that is genuinely difficult to sit with. The enemy narrative doesn't just distort how you see the other person, it distorts how you see yourself. Because as long as someone else is the villain, you don't have to examine your own role. As long as the story is about what they did, you don't have to ask what you need. As long as the case against them is solid enough, the discomfort inside you stays explained. The villain is load-bearing. They're holding something up that you built them to hold, which is why dissolving an enemy narrative is one of the hardest things a human brain can be asked to do. It's not just about changing your mind about a person, it's about being willing to feel the confusion and the threat and the unresolved thing that the villain was protecting you from. Most people never do it. It's easier to keep the villain in place. But consider what you're carrying when you do. Every enemy narrative is a weight, a story that requires maintenance. Every time you see that person, every time someone mentions their name, every time you catch yourself rehearsing the case against them, your nervous system runs the whole thing again. The threat response activates, the stress hormones move through you, the body treats the thought of them the same way it would treat the actual presence of a predator. You are not punishing the villain by keeping them in place. You are living inside the story your brain built to protect itself. Fritz Heider's triangles kept moving after the film ended. The shapes were still just shapes. But the people who watched them walked out of the room carrying a story about a bully and a victim that felt as real as anything that had ever happened to them. Your brain is doing that right now, with real people, in real situations, with all the weight of lived experience making the story feel impossible to question. The villain your brain invented might have done something real. The hurt might be entirely legitimate, but the story built around them, the role they have been cast in, the architecture of certainty your brain constructed to make sense of the threat, that was built by a system that prioritizes your safety over the truth. And it has never once stopped to ask whether the case it built was actually right.